A Shalom Akim Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Rakakadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim and listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to do I guess, comment on something that somebody said to me in conversation, and there was a coworker. This was another Israelite, and he basically asked me, "Why isn't your mind corrupted?" So that was the question, and I don't remember all the details of the conversation, but pretty much in essence, the person asked me, essentially, why isn't your mind corrupted? Because when they discuss their friends, a lot of their friends, when he talks to his friends, a lot of his friends have come from countries abroad. So specifically, it was Saudi Arabia, and then when they move over here, they essentially they forget and cast off their culture, and they take on the philosophies of Babylon the Great, also known as America. And in conversation, they were trying to ask me and trying to figure out, like, why, it's like, yo, why is your mind corrupted? Right? And I don't exactly remember what it is I said, but I thought it would just make an interesting lesson, because this is a byproduct of actually being in Babylon, and not even necessarily being in Babylon, but also being it could be influenced by Babylon, because the wine that emanates, that comes from Babylon, it's very strong. It's not cheap wine. It's filthy wine, but it's not cheap, right? It's very, very strong, right? And this is why culture really and truly is so super duper important, because the culture, keeps us understanding, how to navigate, right? So, I kind of wanted to, I didn't really write anything down. I kind of just wanted to touch on this, because this is something that, is this is one of the reasons, Babylon and these other nations have a strong dislike for America, because of that vibration. When people come here, when they come to America, they essentially cast off what remnants of their culture that they had, and then they start to become more like, in the spirit, Babylonians. They start to, whether it's they shave their head, the women dressed more scantily, they stop dressing in a very modest fashion, they have a strong disrespect for parents, they start maybe getting lineups, they cut their hair off, whatever it is, that goes in contrast to the culture, right? And this is not even the other nations. This includes the other nations, but it also includes our people too, because this is why, really and truly, we're supposed to be separate, right? So let me get a couple precepts, you know um let me start off with Jeremiah, actually. So I guess this is pretty much like the answer, to his question. This is Jeremiah chapter 6, verse 16, and it says, "Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, stand ye in the ways and see, and ask for the old paths. Where is the good way, and walk therein? And ye shall find rest for your souls." But they said, excuse me, but they said, "We will not walk therein." So what we're doing is returning to our culture. We're returning to the ways of how we used to be. We're returning back to, like when you have a phone, we're returning back to factory settings of how we're actually supposed to be. Because, for so long, like it says in Baruch, in the land of their captivity, they shall remember themselves. We're remembering ourselves and remembering the ways of our forefathers and how they conducted themselves. And that is also that's part of our culture. The laws is what keeps you cultivated, and our people look at the laws as something that is grievous. They look at it as something that is a burden, right? They look at it as something that is distasteful, right? But then when you think about it, a lot of our, a lot of the problems that people suffer is really because of lack of culture. If they began to even practice, let's just take for example the dietary law, for example. If you take that and you just stop eating pork, a lot of our people, a lot of their illnesses would go away, a lot of it, right? They wouldn't be having these problems with parasites and inflammation and so on and so forth. But this is what happens when you stray away from your culture. You start to become, like the scripture says in Jeremiah, you start to become a degenerate plant of a strange vine. And we're supposed to be a noble. We're supposed to be trendsetters. We're supposed to be an example of how the nations are supposed to model themselves after, right? But now they're just modeled after basically the ways of Esau, right? And when they see Babylon, they take on those ways, and then they're realizing we don't want these ways in our country, right? So we're not corrupted. Our minds have been washed, right, properly, thoroughly brainwashed in righteousness. Let me get something that Paul said, actually, just to kind of illustrate the point. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2. And it says, "For I am jealous over you with godly jealousy, for I have espoused you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Hamashiach Yahushai, lest I fear, but I fear lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled Eve through subtlety, so your minds should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Hamashiach Yahushai." Right? So our minds are not corrupted by, those different fruits, those different ways, because knowing who we are is also knowing that, we're not supposed to have all these other gods, right? And what happens in Babylon, you get exposed to all these different, a buffet of gods, they have, you have tarot card reading, you have, witchcraft, you have worshiping stones, you have Easter, you have Christmas, you have this and that. And we have our own culture, pursuant to Sirach, the 33rd chapter. We have our own, high days and holy days, and that's bringing us back to our culture, because then we know what happened during those times, and that brings us back to remembrance, right? These customs that our people keep today, they don't bring you back to any sort of remembrance of knowing who you are. So for example, so we're in October, so towards the end of this month, people are going to celebrate Halloween. Halloween doesn't actually bring you towards knowing more about the righteousness of your forefathers, what happened, anything like that. It only brings you towards death, decay, destruction. That's all it does. Carving out pumpkins and all that kind of stuff. The scriptures say, don't learn the ways of the heathen, right? So this is why our minds are not corrupted, because we're not partaking in the same customs, culture of this world, of Babylon, because what comes with their vain holy days, unholy days, I should say it like that, is abominable works, which goes against the law, statutes, and commandments. Their gods require certain types of sacrifices, require certain types of practices, that goes against the way we're supposed to be, or goes against the ways that we're supposed to conduct ourselves, right? Hopefully that is actually piecing together, making sense, right? So we're chaste, And the word chaste refers to a mindset that is pure. We're not focused, we're not going into for example, different philosophies. Oh, let me see. Oh, let me consult Buddha and hear what he's saying. We're not doing that. We understand, knowing who we are, we have one power, Yahweh Bashim Shai. There is no other gods before, other than the Lord. The other nations, their gods are a bunch of idols, right? They're just recycled idols, right? And in Babylon, in Revelation 17, is described as the mother of all harlots. She encapsulates all these different gods of all the ancient kingdoms, whether it was in Neo Babylon, whether it was in what's that kingdom? Achaemenid Empire with Cyrus, the Greeks and the Romans. All these gods are all recycled in some Egypt. They're all recycled, they're all shaped, they're all repackaged, revamped in some shape, way, or fashion, and they're presented in this new captivity, right? This is why our minds are not corrupted, because we understand these other gods are nothing but death, decay, destruction, right? Which goes against our customs, right? This is another point I also wanted to hit too. This is Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 7. And it said, Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord Yahweh's hand. I made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken of her wine. Therefore, the nations are mad. Right? So these philosophies that come out of Babylon are essentially making these other nations drunk. Now they're sobering up, and now they're realizing, man, this was a bunch of nonsense. This was nonsense, right? And then they're waking up now to their senses. That wine is very strong. That wine is not cheap wine. Babylon's wine is not cheap wine. Babylon's wine is very, very strong. It's very, very potent. Hold on. Let me get a precept for that, actually. Just a quick one, then I'll go back to Jeremiah 51. I think it's Ecclesiasticus. This is Ecclesiasticus chapter 19, verse 2. And it says, wine and women will make men of understanding to fall away, and he that cleaveth to harlots will become impudent. So it shows you the power of wine and women, and that is something that is very strongly perpetuated in Babylon the Great. Wine, drinking, revelry. Because I'll give you an example. I remember growing up, and there were these movies called American Pie. And watching these movies, we used to think America was exactly like how these movies portrayed school, and portrayed the lifestyle, the American lifestyle. There were just white women everywhere. Everybody just wanted to have sex. They just wanted to get drunk. It was kind of just like, it was basically just like Pleasure Island, but losing your virginity, and so on and so forth. There was nothing upstanding. But, people see that, a lot of our people see that in a destitute state, and think that, that's going to make us profitable. They think the streets are paved with gold here, the money's growing on trees, and then you're realizing, you come to the country, you're realizing this is a bunch of BS, right? So the point is, it shows you the power of wine, and Babylon's wine is very, very, very strong. It's not cheap wine, but it's very filthy wine. I'll leave it like that, right? So back to Jeremiah 51, this is verse 8, and it says, Babylon is suddenly fallen and destroyed. Howl for her and take balm for her pain, if so she may be healed, and she won't be healed, right? And this is one of the reasons, going back to the power and the strength of the wine, one of the reasons these other countries do not like America, especially countries that belong to like the BRICS nations that have a bit more of a conservative traditions and values. One of the reasons they don't like America is because of the philosophies that come out of America. They don't want anything to do with they don't care about pronouns. They don't care about bestiality. They don't want their women to be scantily dressed, have a masculine frame. They don't want the alphabet culture. They don't want any of these philosophies permeating because they understand, now that they're sobering up, they understand the detrimental effects of what that does to a nation. It destroys a nation, it destroys the women, and it destroys the children. And these are two fundamental building blocks into having good families. So what Babylon has done, especially to our people, taking the men out of the household and uplifted the women, and now the children are essentially running amok, being raised by the state, right? Being raised by a bunch of single mothers, right? And now you have broken families, and now you have a generation that doesn't actually want and see the importance of families. So how does a generation continue if nobody's seeing the value of it, right? So this is the problem with the wine that permeates America, and this is why a lot of these nations ban the entertainment that comes out of Babylon. They don't want it, right? China has done it. I was reading an article recently. It was about the Netflix movies for children, and a lot of those Netflix movies, they've been, Esau is so crafty, where he's been slipping in alphabet agenda within to the children's movies, right? I forgot which one. I think one of them was if I'm not mistaken, I believe it was a Jurassic Park, and I think it was a cartoon. It was a movie, right? But it's Esau is very crafty, right? This is why you have to understand your enemy. The enemy is really trying to get at the children. So what they do is they insert the wine, the philosophies into the children, so it becomes normalized what they're seeing, right? And going back to the culture, this is why culture is important, right? But because of people don't know and care to know who they are, they think the culture is helping them. But this Babylonian culture is not doing anything for you but racking up a bunch of sins. That's why the scriptures say, come out of her, my people. Come out of that filthy, abominable mindset that's not actually serving you. It's doing you very little good, right? So this is verse 9, and it says, we would have healed Babylon, but she is not healed. Forsake her, and let us go everyone into his own country, for her judgment reacheth unto heaven, and is lifted up even to the skies, right? So you see more and more time again, even their own allies have a strong distaste for America, right? So and that's going to perpetuate other prophecies, such as Revelation 17, where the other nations shall hate the whore and burn her with fire, right? They're going to take their opportunity to launch their missiles upon America because they don't like, America is like the big bad wolf, and these other nations, they strongly despise her, and this is one of the reasons why, right? So I'll leave the lesson there, but this is the wine is very strong. It's very, very heavy, and it permeates into these other nations. This is why a lot of these other nations, they ban a lot of their content that comes out of America, because they don't want that affecting their children, right? So I'll leave the lesson there, but Lord's will, this was quick, edifying, and just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.